So, same thing applies as always when I talk about anything that's remotely negative. Please don't try to like contact, harass, whatever, any of the people involved in the situation. This situation has already been resolved. Everyone would like to move on. And also, my intention here, as much as some of the mistakes that Offkai has made have been embarrassingly silly, but the intention is to point out where they've gone wrong so that they have a chance at not making the same mistakes in the future. So, throughout the entire situation, the thing that has made Offkai fascinating to watch is the fact that in between controversies, you could see in real time the goodwill draining out of the public with with everything that popped up. So for people who watched my first video, this tier list might look a little familiar because it's the tier list I used to judge how Niji Sanji was doing PR-wise with their strategy around the Selen termination. And to be fair, again, you can kind of see Offkai moving gradually from the bottom closer and closer to the top every time they have a controversy. But before we get into like actually taking apart what was going on, thankfully, we have, now that everything seems to have passed by and resolved itself, we have a concrete base to do a complete analysis of what has been going wrong with Offkai. But before we get into actually dissecting it, we need context. If you don't know what Offkai is, it's basically a VTuber convention that's hosted in California annually. So, for the purposes of explaining, the controversies that Offkai has gone through, the three main ones I want to focus on are these. So the first one being the Ethyria incident, the second one being the Kirsche incident, and the third one being the Phase Connect incident. And I'll go through what goes into, like, you know, what went into each of these three as well. So, oh boy. Okay, so with the Ethyria incident, to understand this, the full context, we're going to need to go all the way back to December of last year. December 20th to be exact, when they first announced that Ethyria would be featured as special guests in their convention. And again, they have this promotional reply to their tweet on the 21st. But, as we all know, on December 25th, the Selen thing happened. And this was a mistake that Niji Sanji made that they are still paying for today. However, while this was all going down, if you guys remember, Height, which was a business partner, I think a PC building company that was paired up with Niji Sanji, dropped their partnership. You had a lot of other people dropping their brand deals, partnerships, sponsorships, whatever with Niji as well. And Offkai was no different, except people who were going to attend Offkai, people who had bought tickets and badges, would not be hearing about this for the next few months, until the 5th of March, when False ID made this tweet. Hearing of strange VTuber guest and vendor rejections from Offkai Expo 2024. DMs are open, reach out if you wish to share, even as anonymous. And the image that he attached to this tweet was a photoshopped version of Offkai's guest page, where they prominently featured Niji Sanji's, Ethyria. And he photoshopped that next to the notice of rejection of Offkai Expo guest application. Now, I'm pretty sure the insinuation here was that Niji Sanji might have had something to do with the guest and vendor rejections. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the implication. But then Offkai replied by saying, "We're deeply concerned to see there's talks of strange guest and vendor rejections and would like to assure people that Niji Sanji has not influenced our guest or vendor haul decisions at any point in time." But that wasn't the end of it, because then, on the same day, they posted this important announcement. After thoughtful consideration, Offkai Expo believes that recent events have resulted in an environment where Ethyria appearing would not be conducive to a positive convention experience for any Color Inc.'s livers or our attendees. As such, Enna Alouette, Millie Parfait, and Reimu Endo will not be appearing at Offkai Expo 2024. Badge refunds may be requested until April 30th at their website. We apologize for any inconvenience caused. And then they replied with this: for the record, this was a decision made 2 weeks prior and no relation to today's events and misunderstandings. Thank you for your patience. Now, there is a very obvious problem with only announcing this after False tweeted this, because regardless of what has happened behind the scenes, and I think it is very realistic to assume that Offkai wasn't able to talk about this publicly until Niji gave them the all clear due to some sort of legal or business agreement that they had between them. This really does make it look like they are only announcing it because of False. And again, here's the thing. From the public's perspective, they had 2 weeks from the time that they made this decision to inform the public, and they didn't. So while it might have had a legitimate reason, they very much look like they are having their hand forced. They aren't announcing this of their own volition. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind when we go forward, because that will become a recurring theme later on. In response to this, the day afterwards, False then made, one of his videos where he talked about this happening in addition to a bunch of other VTuber news. But the main angle that he went with in this video was Offkai dropped Ethyria. So, I want to briefly touch on the difference between drama and journalism. So, a large criticism of False's video was that he was breaking journalistic integrity because, to put it simply, he was responsible for the event on which he was reporting. And I want to push back against that, because here's the thing. Even though news includes both drama and journalism, there is a difference between the two, and the difference comes from the purpose behind the news and the involvement that the reporter has in creating the event that is being reported on. So, for drama, the purpose of drama is to create controversy, create discussion. And, usually, if a reporter has a higher degree of involvement in the main event that's being reported on, that leans closer to drama than it does to journalism. Journalism is quite different because the main intention, the main purpose behind journalism is to inform. And for journalistic ethical standards all revolve around the shared principle of not creating the thing that you are reporting on. So, here's the thing. When people were criticizing False's video as being drama, what I assume was going on was that they were conflating his video with his tweet, because this can reasonably be construed as drama, because False is soliciting people's information. He's soliciting discussion around the topic of possible guest and vendor rejections. So the tweet, can be construed as drama, but the video is not. And the reason for that is because the video centered around the fact that Offkai had dropped these guests seemingly without telling the public. And that is a decision that False had absolutely no control over. Even if you believe that that Offkai only announced the drop of Ethyria because of False, that's not the main premise of his video, nor of his reporting. So, again, this falls more into journalism, this falls more into drama, and this is like a broader issue when it comes to people conflating different types of content that people make on different platforms as well. So, yeah, that was the whole Ethyria incident. So, at the end of this, what we get is a public that perceives Offkai, starting to give Offkai a little bit of side-eye about being willing to report on internal decisions in an open and clear manner. Fast forward by 2 months to May 11th, when on that day, we get joint announcements from Rev Says Desu and Darling Straub about how they are no longer attending Offkai because Kirsche Verstal had supposedly been blacklisted from the convention. Now, again, this is a pretty bad look, because this was the first time that the public had any inkling that this was going on. But at this point, it's just speculative. The only thing is, later on in the day, Kirsche herself went live and, among other things, confirmed that this was true, that she had indeed been blacklisted. And her, the section where she was talking about this was signal boosted by Azahara. So, again, I want to remind you, at this point in time, Offkai has not said anything about this happening. We are only finding out from two creators that were not directly affected by this, and the creator that was. So again, not a great look PR-wise when it comes to your willingness to communicate and be open with things to the public. But it gets worse when you look at the reasons behind her getting blacklisted. Because Kirsche tried to contact Offkai's staff to ask for the reasons behind her blacklisting, and what she was given were a bunch of keyword-searched, hand-picked tweets that were taken out of context, all of which were taken out of context, and with the implication that she was quote-unquote too controversial to attend. And as to why these tweets, as to who these tweets were too controversial for, Kirsche showed screenshots from a conversation that she had with Offkai's Lysander, who was Offkai's director. And in these screenshots, he admits that the reasons behind her blacklisting were because the tweets were too controversial for some of the volunteers that were working at the convention. So these volunteers had presumably keyword searched these tweets that they found offensive, fed them all to Offkai's management, and then delivered an ultimatum. Either Kirsche walks or we walk. And in this case, Offkai made the decision to keep the volunteers. But there was more. Because in a moment of confusion, Kirsche essentially bluffed that she knew that last year the same issue had happened with FaZe Connect's Pipkin Pippa, where a bunch of volunteers had been very vocal on social media as to their distaste for her and then threatened to walk. In actuality, this didn't happen publicly with Offkai but with another convention, Yumicon. However, Lysander confirms that this situation did indeed happen with Offkai as well, and that in that particular instance, the staff who were creating a problem ended up walking. Again, in contrast to the Ethyria incident, where there is a reasonable expectation that Offkai's lack of communication was involuntary, this was a situation where the lack of communication was very much voluntary. Fast forward to the FaZe Connect incident, and for this, to understand the context behind how this ended up creating a massive problem for Offkai, again, we're going to have to take a little bit of a gander back in time to April 17th, when Offkai first announced that FaZe Euphoria was going to be in attendance. Again, this was a pretty hype announcement. I am a FaZe fan. A lot of people are FaZe fans. And this was, again, the business partnership between FaZe and Offkai runs pretty deep. Because on April 23rd, about a week later, they would announce that FaZe is, yet again, sponsoring the Offkai Vendor Hall. Now, FaZe Connect didn't just sponsor the Vendor Hall. They fucking bought it. So what essentially happened was that FaZe Connect had decided to pay for all of the booth and table costs for all of the vendors. So what that meant was that all of the vendors could now show up, do their thing, and then ask for a refund from Offkai for their fees, and they would be given them. Now, as you can imagine, this was a massive PR win for both FaZe and Offkai, because Fishman had taken, he had done more than just take his Piscine meat and flop it onto the table. What that did was it created a relationship between Offkai and FaZe that was more human than it was corporate. See, the thing is, with FaZe, Sakana is a very humanizing face to what would otherwise be just a company. Like, this is something that everyone who watches FaZe would be very well acquainted with, but I cannot stress enough how far Sakana's image goes in terms of humanizing the company, humanizing the management. And as a result of that, I believe an unintentional result of that, the relationship between Offkai and FaZe Connect became something more akin to a feeling of obligation in return for, a public show of generosity. Because no matter what people say, there is no such thing as free generosity. Regardless of what happens, if you offer someone generosity and you make it public, the public will then attribute a feeling of obligation that now goes the other way in response for that, in return for that generosity. So, again, I want you to keep that in mind, right? FaZe Connect fans were cheering, Offkai vendors were, they needed a change of underwear, things were going great. Until June the 2nd, when, ironically, a performance called The Disappearance of Pippa and Tenma would actually end up disappearing when streamed to audiences outside of Offkai. So essentially what happened was this performance was streamed live on Twitch from Offkai's account. And after, I think, a single performance by Tenma, the performance was interrupted by a series of ads. And those ads played for almost the entirety of the performance, right up until the end. Now, people were very reasonably confused as to what the hell was going on, because, like, essentially what happened was people tuned in expecting like a concert, a performance, like, hanging out with their Oshis virtually, and all they got was a slew of ads. And mind you, these weren't pre-roll ads that Twitch automatically puts onto each of your streams. These were mid-roll ads, which are put on your stream at the discretion of the streamer. Later on in the day, Offkai would put out a tweet where they addressed the situation. We had some internal miscommunications regarding the streaming of FaZe Connect's panel, resulting in an unintended broadcast and poor stream experience. As always, we appreciate our friends at FaZe. Now, leaving aside the fact that this is very obviously a rushed tweet, it's very vague. And the reason why it being vague, well, I mean, like, look at it. Internal miscommunications. What on earth does that mean? So, bear in mind, this was a very vague way of addressing the situation. And on its own, that wouldn't have been a problem. Again, fans would have been disgruntled, but they probably would have forgiven Offkai if FaZe Connect expressed that they were okay with it, they were willing to move on as well. But the reason why this tweet in particular came off so badly was because this wasn't actually the first instance where Offkai had communicated what was going on. The first instance came from the stream in the Twitch chat when an Offkai moderator by the name of Gustavo BCC decided to reply to a bunch of fans expressing their confusion, asking what is going on, why did we get a whole bunch of ads in just like 10 minutes of a random segment? And the mod replies, FaZe's decision, not ours. A very brusque, very curt response to a very reasonable sense of confusion. This guy, Gustavo BCC, would go on to become a defining feature of a lot of subsequent discussions and speculation about what actually happened during this event. And that leads us in to the main problem that Offkai has faced throughout the entirety of all three of these controversies. And that is that Offkai is a headless organization. Alright, so I want to do a little bit of a thought experiment with you guys. And I'll use FaZe because it's the most convenient and, example at hand. When I ask you to picture FaZe Connect management, who and what do you think of? Now, a lot of you, especially FaZe fans, might picture Mume. Some of you may picture the other managers as well, like Aiko, like Cece, like Cookie. I hope I'm saying that right. Because again, these are managers that Phase Connect talents have praised on stream numerous times for making their lives much easier. Some of you who are familiar with deep lore, or I guess deeper lore, might even picture Dizzy. But almost everybody, regardless of whether if you're a Phase Connect fan or not, will picture Sakana. And this is very important to any sort of corporate PR strategy, because in Sakana, Phase Connect has someone who everybody can look to when it comes to matters of, confusion as regards to business strategy, or if they have some sort of merchandising problem, or if they were curious about the direction of the company, or any issues that arise as a result of, God forbid, misconduct or anything like that. So again, Phase Connect has a very clear head. Fishman, despite being like a meme as far as the talents go, he is undeniably the head of Phase Connect. And what's more important, the public knows that. And so when he speaks up, the public listens to what he says. Now, I want you to try to do the same thing for Offkai. Can you picture anybody? Chances are, some of you might come up with names. Lysander, Gustavo. But those are the ones that have been brought up by other creators who are involved in the event or attended the event. Can you actually picture anybody from Offkai who is, can you picture them? And the answer for most of you, I suspect, will be no. Offkai is an organization, an event, that lacks a distinct leader and lacks a distinct spokesperson. And the reason why this is such an issue goes all the way back to the fundamentals of communication, right? And this is by the fundamentals, I mean the fundamentals, first year undergrad media studies. So, one of the simplest models that we have when it comes to theorizing how communication works is something called the bullet theory model. Oh, Rue, thank you for the super chat. There's only one culprit in this, California. I don't know enough about California to speak about that, but I have not heard good things about California. So yeah, the bullet theory model is basically that, very simple. You have a sender of a message who uses a medium to direct a message towards a target audience, a receiver, right? Again, very simple. Medium, message, receiver, gun. Okay? And this assumes a very straightforward relationship between the sender of message and the receiver of message, in that it's just a one-way directional thing where there are only two parties involved in the equation. Now, the only problem is social media has complicated this simple model to the point where it's no longer really relevant. And it's done that by introducing a bunch of new variables, so that nowadays, instead of this being an accurate representation of how communication works, it looks more like this. Now, there are two things that social media has done to change the way that model works. First of all, everything has an audience now. Regardless of what you're doing, there is always going to be a peanut gallery either watching what it is you say and do, or waiting for you to say and do something. The second thing that social media has done is that it's made the medium that you use to communicate and the receiver of your communications inseparable from one another. Now, what that means is, regardless of whether your message hits or misses, it will now stay on that medium. And when this audience looks at you trying to communicate to see what is going on, they will now be looking at your act of communication in the context of everything else you've said or done that has been preserved on a platform, on a website. And when you put it all together, you might end up getting a picture that you never meant to paint. On top of that, the messages that other people say in the same context of what you're trying to say will end up being preserved as well. So they will be taken as part of your communications, regardless of whether you like it or not. And again, the result of all of this is that people are now less focused on this and more focused on this. So, how does that work when it comes to Offkai? One of the things that we get taught about in PR is the difference between an audience and a public. Now, a public is a sort of media-specific term that basically just means a targeted audience. And the reason why it's important to make a separation between these two is because an audience is just who happens to be watching, whereas a public is a group of people that you have, you've essentially profiled. Part of creating a public actually involves like creating individual profiles of people, real life people, or people who could be real life, who you assume are going to be the target of your messaging. This, coincidentally, also happens to be why everything that is promoted on the basis of appealing to a modern audience tends to fall flat, because an audience, by definition, is unfocused, whereas a public is very much focused. Now, again, the thing that I want you to remember above all is that an audience is not human, but a public is. When it comes to PR as well, generally speaking, in our first year of doing PR, so this is like second year of media school, something like that, we're given like 4 basic models for how PR communication is done. Half of these are one-way models, which means that it only consists of a corporation or a company talking to their audience. The other half are symmetrical or two-way models, where, two-way models, where it's consisted of a dialogue between the audience and the corporation/company. Now, each of these has its own distinct advantages and disadvantages. Actually, in future, maybe I'll do a stream in the future where I take the major VTubing companies and try to allocate them to which model they seem to be using in their PR strategy. But anyways, yeah, so the press agent model is basically generating as much engagement as possible, as much attention as possible. So, press agent model involves the selective disclosure of information, with persuasion being the primary goal. Essentially what you do is that you selectively pick out stuff that's going on inside your company, and you promote your company using that selectively presented information to create the best possible public image of your company, right? And on the surface, this is like the way that most PR works, or at least this is the kind of PR that you observe most often, because when it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong. This model of communication is extremely vulnerable to disruption, whether it be disruption from the inside when it comes to, like, let's say a disgruntled employee expressing their turmoil experiences, whatever, in the public view, or whether it comes from outside when it comes to people questioning the image that you're putting out. So again, the strength of this is that you have a very strong brand image, or you can have a very strong brand image, but the weakness is that it's very vulnerable to disruption. On the total opposite side of the spectrum, you have public information, the public information model, where you do not discriminate as to what you put out into the public eye. You put out everything into the public eye. And again, the goal of this communication model is not persuasion, but information. You want the public to be as informed as possible, and you hope, you have faith that them being informed about your business will make them more supportive of your business. So, this is less vulnerable to disruption, but at the cost that if something goes wrong internally, everyone will know about it. But again, depending on the business in question, that might be a more preferable outcome to when this goes wrong. Because again, as a direct result of this difference between how they present themselves, companies that adopt this model of communication tend to suffer less from controversies than businesses that adopt this communication model. Now, when it comes to the two-way models of communication, on one side you have asymmetrical. Now, what that means is it's not truly asymmetrical in the sense that the corporation doesn't listen to the public at all. It just means that the corporation doesn't let the public know that they are listening. So what happens is the audience is not engaged directly, but every time someone provides feedback from the audience, every time an audience provides feedback, what happens is this company will, behind the scenes, take note of that feedback and adjust their communications accordingly. Now, the thing is, when you do this well, it's almost indistinguishable from this. So when you're trying to observe which model of communication the company in question is using, it can be very difficult to tell whether they're using press agent or whether they're just doing asymmetrical really, really well. So, on the other side, you have symmetrical, where the audience is engaged directly, the audience is aware that they're being engaged, and in contrast to this, where the audience is engaged with the purpose of persuading them to, support the company. The symmetrical model does not care about whether they are persuaded or not, and just engages the audience with the hope that that engagement in and of itself will create support. Now, based off of these four, and based on what we've talked about so far, I think it's safe to say that Offkai is asymmetrical, but executed very badly. So, because they are taking on feedback in between controversies, it's just that their ability to react to that feedback seems to be a little sluggish, to say the least. Now, in addition to these four PR comms models, we also get taught three distinct functions of PR. And those are propaganda and persuasion, basically the one-way communication when a corporation is just trying to influence its publics. Accommodation and capitulation, which is the opposite, where PR is responsible for getting the corporation or company to acquiesce to the demands of their publics. And then the third option, which is dialogue and compromise, where PR is in charge of getting both the public and the company into a sort of middle ground where the situation is agreeable to both of them. Now, as a horror, they don't even have a model, they just say whatever the hell suits their narrative. Yeah, okay, again, it's always reactive, never proactive. We'll get into that in a second. So, again, functions of PR. The problem is, right, and this is kind of ironic because PR itself has a PR problem as an industry, where most people, when they think about PR, they don't think about accommodation. They don't think about dialogue and compromise. They only think about this function of PR. They only think about capitulation. And there is a reason for that. Because the kinds of PR that you tend to see most often, the kinds of PR that tend to be the most visible, are examples of bad PR. PR that is unethical and or ineffective. Because again, the best kind of PR is the PR that you do not notice or do not remember. So almost always it's because someone has attempted to convey something to you in terms of like messaging, propaganda, persuasion, and it's failed miserably. Those are the ones that tend to stick in your brain. Now, PR is trying to address a very fundamental problem. Right? Regardless of which function it's going with, which model it's going with, it's trying to solve the fundamental issue that corporations, companies, and organizations are not human, but their publics are. So when I say that corporations, companies, and organizations are not human, I know, and you all know this as well, that even though their management, their staff, are people, these business entities themselves are not people. As such, these business entities cannot operate as if they have a conscience or something else like that. And I do think that a conscience is one of the defining factors in whether something can be considered human or not. So the thing is, in the best case scenario, the best use of PR, and this is when PR is number one, proactive, and number two, involved before a crisis happens, not afterwards. Ideally, PR is supposed to function as the closest thing a business entity can get to a conscience. Because what PR is supposed to do, when it's not when it's not straight out in crisis management or damage control, is that it's supposed to advise the company on what will or won't benefit their publics, what will or won't be received well by their publics. And ideally, a corporation will be able to take note of that and operate accordingly. So perfect PR, good PR, is not when you fuck up and then you have to try and fix the situation. It's when you prevent the fuck up happening in the first place. And this gets into part of how I want you to conceptualize PR. Because on the scale of good PR to bad PR, I want you to conceptualize it as like three main stages, right? Right. At the, peak PR is corporate conscience. So what I explained earlier, when PR is able to function as the closest thing effectively as possible to actually having a conscience, despite not being human. At the middle, right, this is where, you can either go back towards good PR or tip further down into bad PR. You have apology, recovery, and reform. This is what happens when, a company either doesn't listen to what their PR is saying, or has made a mistake that is, or had, suffered from a circumstance that is outside of their control. And now the main objective is to recover, reform, and, survive, essentially, right? Hopefully, now what usually happens is, as a crisis gets worse, a company drops down this meter, and here, most good PR strategies will allow them to transition back into rising up towards corporate conscience. But in the case that this doesn't work, in the case that a company does something so heinous, so unethical, that there is no coming back from it, then you get bad PR, which is just damage control. So another thing that I want to point out is that bad PR, when I say bad PR, I don't mean like ineffective PR necessarily. Bad PR is unethical PR because fundamentally, there's no point in trying to get across your messaging in an ethical manner if the thing that you're trying to communicate is fundamentally unethical. PR is incapable of giving a company, an organization, ethics at this stage. Because again, like I said before, at this stage, the company itself has done something fundamentally unethical that can no longer be hidden and can no longer be justified. So any PR they do will just be to minimize the amount of punishment they receive from the public, which means that it usually falls into the category of being, avoiding accountability, avoiding responsibility, and therefore unethical. Offkai, I would say, is like currently, or at least when the whole Face Connect thing happened, around here, because they kind of missed the chance to apologize, recover, and reform when it was going down because of Gustavo BCC. But they aren't here yet, and I think we all know who is here right now, who is still here right now. So anyways, some of the features of good PR, and again, this is something that the people who watch my first video will be familiar with. Three main features that I want to emphasize. One is proactivity and timeliness, which is basically your ability to address problems either before they arise or immediately after they arise. So like I said before, there will be some circumstances, some situations that arise that you have no control over. This is where the ideal virtue of proactivity is replaced by just being being timely with your response. Because when this is no longer possible, this is the next best thing. When something goes wrong, you want to make sure that you respond to it as soon as possible before damage is done to your public image that you cannot recover from. The second thing is professionalism, and this is something that PR has been emphasizing a lot over the past few decades to try and combat its own PR problem, where it's basically just your ability to have ethical conduct while you're doing your job, right? And this is why good PR is so close to corporate conscience, because this is essentially a balancing act between morality and business sense. You can't tip too far into either or, because when you conduct business without a sense of professionalism, people will inevitably begin to hate you. But if you go too far into valuing morality over your business sense, then you are at risk of compromising the viability of your business. So ideally, professionalism is a balance between these two qualities. The last thing is clarity. Now, clarity basically means that your communications are clear, they are targeted, and that they actually fit in whatever context they are seen in. Now, a lot of people assume that a clear message just means that when you're in the boardroom coming up with it, then you phrase it well, or you make sure you don't offend anybody, or something like that. That is a part of clarity, but that is not the only part of clarity, because the bulk of ensuring that your messaging has clarity is actually looking at the context in which your communications will be occurring and understanding what other messages exist in that context that might affirm, contest, or outright conflict with whatever it is you are about to say. And unfortunately, with Offkai, there have been gaps in their approach towards PR that fall under each of these three categories. Already we can see Offkai failing at the first and the third. They fail at the second too, for reasons that we'll get into in a second. And the thing that makes Offkai's mistakes so important to learn from, I suppose, is the fact that any one of their mistakes on its own probably would have been fine. But when all three are put together, each controversy compounds the impact of the one that comes after it significantly, to the point where, when you really look at the three controversies in the context of one another, you get a picture that looks a little bit like this. So, when it comes to stringing together how exactly these controversies ended up feeding into one another, start off with the first one. What essentially happened, like I said before, with the first controversy was that Offkai had a legitimate reason to be tardy to the party when it comes to their own communications. But at this stage, people were still willing to believe that this was involuntary. However, with the Kirsche situation, Offkai had now lost that privilege. People were now looking at them with suspicion because this was completely voluntary. Offkai didn't put out any official announcement, any official messaging, anything like that. And again, I can't stress this enough. People didn't find out from Offkai. People found out from other creators that were supposed to be attending. And again, the next thing that happened was that the Kirsche situation also compromised Offkai's ability to be professional in their conduct, because what Offkai did when they decided to blacklist Kirsche was they set two very dangerous precedents for themselves. First, they established that the volunteers get a say in which creators attend as guests or panelists. But the second thing, and this is where it all really falls apart, Offkai set the precedent that people in attendance could be vetted based on their previous social media posts. And it didn't even have to be something especially egregious. It could just be a bunch of things strung together with very little context and presented as if it offends people. So, again, establishing that as a standard that you are willing to espouse is a problem, because this was not a standard that Offkai's own staff lived up to. So, like I said before, Gustavo ended up becoming a defining feature of a lot of speculation around what the hell was going on with FaZe Connect's event. So, because this had now been established as a precedent, people started digging through Gustavo's social media. And all you could see, right? Initially, so these two were replies to Offkai's initial official communication, official post about what supposedly went wrong, an internal miscommunication around FaZe Connect's event. And this was Trigger Point coming in with the steel chair to really, really put into context the kind of person that had now come to define Offkai's decision-making communications by speaking up in response to people in the chat in this manner. Again, people probably would not be doing this if Offkai hadn't set that own precedent for themselves with Kirsche. So essentially by doing that, they had just shot themselves in the foot, because when people actually did start combing through Gustavo's posts, what they found was that Gustavo very publicly expressed a distaste for Pippa as well as Kirsche. And again, Kirsche got booted for far less than this. This was an explicit sort of, how do I put this? An explicit snipe at a member of one of the main sponsors, one of the largest sponsors for this event. And the fact that Offkai did not pick up on this when they set that precedent with Kirsche is very frankly embarrassing. Now, the problem is, when I talked earlier about needing to take into account the messages that are occurring in the context within which you try to communicate yourself, the problem that Offkai was now facing is that they were trying to communicate this when this already existed in the space. And what happens is that this sole remark, FaZe's decision, not ours, recontextualizes what Offkai could mean by internal miscommunications. Because, again, I can only assume that this was not information that was supposed to be shared with the public. Because this was not information that you could glean by looking at this post by itself. And here's the thing. When you look at internal miscommunications in the context of this now becomes a blame game between FaZe and Offkai. Because this makes it sound like the internal miscommunications came solely from FaZe Connect. And again, you can say that that might be the case, you can say that that's not the case, but either way, it's not a great look when you start blasting the sponsor that bought out your vendor hall. And you could see that happening in real time. Because people started to pick up on this, and now, because of what I mentioned earlier with the sort of obligation-based relationship that FaZe now had with Offkai, that was now rearing up to blast Offkai in the face. Because everyone was now talking about, damn, I can't believe you've treated Sakana and his company like this. Why did you do this? This can only be construed maliciously. And again, in fairness to the people who were saying this, it does look malicious. Because at minimum, best case scenario, you are now playing a blame game. At worst case scenario, this really does look like sabotage, especially when you put it in context of what Kirsche went through. So, I can't stress this enough. This would not be a problem if it happened on its own. It's only made worse because of everything that happened before it. And not only that, other creators started jumping in as well. So you had Alara who confirmed that even though she has done work with a lot of other creators, she was rejected from a panel. And again, on its own, not much of a story. But now that you know that there are insidious bad actors in Offkai, regardless of how sparsely they may be distributed, this is now a question that is worth asking. Same thing with Nanobytes, where she stated, yeah, assuming that shit's true, Offkai, what the fuck y'all doing? Even though we don't have confirmation whether it's true or not, based on past things, I wouldn't be quick to doubt it. It's just super petty. And again, I can't stress enough, the only reason why this is actually something that holds water is because of Offkai's own actions. And then you have Legal Mindset coming in with the Offkai Expo volunteer agreement. And there is a specific section of the agreement where Offkai really fell through the cracks. And that is the fourth paragraph. Only designated officers may speak on behalf of Offkai or its sponsored events. Volunteers and vendors of Offkai may not share confidential or privileged information or disparage Offkai or its events in public forums, including but not limited to Twitter, Facebook, Discord, and Twitch. So, again, that whole thing about FaZe Connect making the call as to play ads instead of to stream the event, I can only assume that was not information that was supposed to be shared, because that was not information that was shared in Offkai's official announcement. Again, the fact that Offkai's representative in this situation for a good deal of time after it happened was Gustavo and not Offkai, not Lysander, not anyone else from the convention is a really bad look, because what you have is a supposed volunteer, assuming that he's not actually a designated officer. Now, what you had was a volunteer that had very publicly stated the distaste for one of the performers and who had been at the very least a mod, at the time that all of it was going down. So, what that does is that this has now become the main message when it comes to the way that Offkai's future communications would be interpreted. Offkai's own Twitter account was now playing second fiddle to a rogue moderator. And the reason, again, I cannot stress this enough, this was an entirely preventable communication disaster. Because this only happened as a result of things going on behind the scenes, other problems that Offkai is facing as a convention. Because they have Offkai, and again, I say this with full awareness that I have no experience running a con. I don't know what goes into running a con. I can only make observations based on how this thing looks from like the most basic of PR principles. But what this looks like is that Offkai is struggling with internal affairs, like how to balance the influence or, the contributions of volunteers versus the integrity in their conduct towards their sponsors. This is stuff like, tech issues. This is stuff like problems with hosting performances, etc., infrastructural problems as well. And again, all of these internal problems that might not seem like they have anything to do with PR then go on to become a PR problem when something like this arises. Because, see, regardless of what Offkai has said or what comes out about, whether it was actually FaZe Connect's decision or not, Offkai now owes FaZe Connect a public apology, not because the performance had issues, but because this was the way in which those issues were presented. And this gets into the next point, which is, the best PR is the work you take for granted, and the messages you take as facts. Everyone assumes that when you have volunteers for a convention, those volunteers don't get to decide who actually goes and who doesn't. Everyone assumes that when you host a performance, when you stream a performance, and when something goes wrong, you aren't going to start a blame game as to who made it go wrong. Because again, this is all the work you put in beforehand, the work environment you cultivated beforehand, to make sure those things don't become a problem. The kind of, again, the work you take for granted is a really big thing, because good PR is not like, it's not a PR agent standing in front of a press conference trying to explain why their company enslaved, basically used slave labor to make their products or anything like that, right? It's managers who care about the people working under them. It's directors or a CEO who, is not only astute enough to understand the weaknesses in their own leadership or in their, in the organization they run, but humble enough to listen to others when it comes to, how to solve those problems. It's, individual workers who not only feel a sense of responsibility towards their own well-being, their own content, but towards the well-being and content of their peers as well. And on the topic of that, I think this was 2 days ago, Pipkin Pippa did a stream where she just watched Offkai videos. Spencer, thanks for the super chat. Nanobytes as a former PC talent that added weight. Yeah, for sure. Because that just really confirmed to everyone in the know that Offkai really fucked up there. But yeah, so Pippa did a stream where she was reviewing videos from Offkai. And in it, there was a short segment where she addressed the situation as well. And essentially, what Pippa did was extend an olive branch towards Offkai. She stressed that, the overwhelming majority of the staff and volunteers at Offkai were great people. She expressed that she understood that, when you're running convention, sometimes things go wrong. So she stressed that, again, she understands that things can go wrong with Offkai. And she said to her fans, she asked her fans to consider, volunteering at Offkai as well. And again, throughout the entire thing, Pippa never pointed the finger at Offkai. I cannot stress enough how important it was that you had a FaZe talent, without a doubt one of the largest FaZe talents, one who was primarily affected by that disaster, coming out and saying, look, don't blame them, right? It's not their fault. This was like, again, one of the most responsible ways that she could have tackled the situation. And in it, part of it, I think she confirmed that, again, like, you know, there was going to be a next year, that Phase Connect wasn't dropping out of Offkai, and that, again, what that also means is that Offkai does have a chance for redemption. So, but on the topic of people speaking up for Offkai, on the same day, we got another false ID video. This time, where an anonymous insider from Offkai provided more information as to what allegedly happened behind the scenes, where they confirmed that the final call to stream ads instead of the performance was made by FaZe, but that the mod, Gustavo, was indeed kicked as a result of some actions of that stream. Now, on one hand, it's a little cathartic to get some confirmation as to what the fuck was going on there, but on the other hand, this has only come across to us through an anonymous source via false ID, and whether you believe it or not will depend a lot on how much you trust False's reporting. For me, personally, I think this is good enough. I think False has proven that his inside sources are actually reliable. But again, I understand that might not go for everyone, and in the case that it doesn't go for you, that's also fair enough. But thanks for the super chat, Tortillas, because she knows basic PR. Yeah, it never fails to amaze me how PR trained FaZe Connect talents can be, or it can seem, despite how menhera their public image is, and despite how their corpo is like several sizes smaller than like the big two, or the big one, I guess now. But yeah, so Offkai's way of communicating this was through an anonymous source via false ID. And again, this was never communicated publicly, even though this, at the very minimum, it should have been communicated that the mod that spoke up out of turn was booted from Offkai. Because again, if you don't issue an apology, at least account for what the hell happened there. And this all leads to a very interesting phenomenon, a very embarrassing situation that you don't often see when it comes to PR from an organization. And that is that paradoxically, Offkai has become the least reliable source when it comes to their own communications. If you really think about it, throughout all three of these controversies, no one's looking to Offkai or their leadership, their social media, or anything like that for confirmation as to what the fuck is going on. They're all getting their information or looking to other creators. False is, of course, the big one who's been there throughout the entire time, but they also look towards, Rev, Straub, Pippa, Kirsche, anyone else on Twitter, minus Gustavo, and FaZe Connect. So, again, nobody cares about what Offkai has to say anymore, because they've allowed so much of their communications to be dictated by literally everybody else. Matthew, thank you for the super chat. The problem that it comes across as anonymous, even though False said it, is that it can still be total BS from the source. Oh yeah. Again, that's why it's so damaging that Offkai didn't say this through their official channels or through an official spokesperson. Because, again, they don't even have an official spokesperson. So we get this whole situation. And if you take away nothing else from this stream, I want you to remember, regardless of who you are, make sure you know who represents you. Make sure that everyone else knows who represents you. Because when shit hits the fan, when people are looking for someone to represent you, if you haven't decided on a representative, if you haven't made it clear who your representative is, the public will allocate one for you. And you might not like what that representative has to say.